Okay, so we're going to be covering the rest of the Cold War. As you know, this is an overview, so it's not everything that is every little fact and detail. Here are a few things that we do need to think about. Okay, so we can look at the causes of the breakup of the USSR, Gorbachev, and how he's the last Soviet General Secretary, leader in charge of the Soviet Union, and through him we're going to see it fall. And also there's going to be revolutions that happen in Eastern Europe in 1989, and these are going to be actually successful and significant in terms of turning the tide of the Soviet Union losing its influence over their satellite states. And then we talked about a little bit in class Yugoslavia and how there's a civil war crisis going on there, but also there's something called the Velvet Revolution, which we'll go over today. I really like this picture, the rise and fall of the Soviet Union, because it just shows, what we covered this year. We covered, starting from Lenin. We talked about how this is such a revolutionary thing that, the first time ever in history that we can see a whole empire overturn, an establishment that's been around, right? A regime that's been here for 300 years under the Romanovs, and then over time you can kind of see how the Soviet Union has transformed in ideology and in practice. And here you have Gorbachev, face palming himself and seeing that it's over. Okay, all right. So on Wednesday, we went over decolonization, right? And we talked about how nationalism is kind of the main motive, the main factor of why decolonization happened, along with other causes, right? Because of what happened after World War II. Keep this sheet out. We're going to refer to it eventually when I talk about, Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, also revolution in 1989. That we have a place for it. Otherwise, you're taking notes on your own paper because I can't make time to do all this. Okay, so all right, here we go. We had Khrushchev, right? Khrushchev comes after Stalin. Then we have the Brezhnev era, Leonid Brezhnev. So in '64, this is where Brezhnev's taking over, and because Khrushchev brought in a lot of reforms, this is where Brezhnev is more conservative, and he's going to re-Stalinize to a degree. Not completely, but because of the failure in foreign policy of Khrushchev through the Cuban Missile Crisis, right, and even needing to create the Berlin Wall, this is where we see that the Soviet Union is looking to, get a hold of themselves, and right, and to restabilize themselves. They are not trying to necessarily just start wars because they feel stronger, but they are actually trying to maintain a stronger base in Eastern Europe, but at the same time trying to have a more peaceful coexistence with the United States. Okay, so now this is where the Soviet Union's pretty much controlled by the conservatives, and a lot of those liberals that had the freedom to voice their opinions in the Soviet Union, not a chance. They'd be kicked out or thrown in to some type of political prison. Okay. All right. So major event: Prague Spring happens in Czechoslovakia in 1968. We talked about how there were uprisings in Poland and Hungary in '56, but in '68, this is going to be part of the Brezhnev era, okay, and then you have in Czechoslovakia you have Alexander Dubček, okay, and he is the elected leader, and he wanted to bring a new period of kind of changing how communism and socialism works, and so the Czechoslovakian government, their Communist Party, they voted out the old communist leader, and now, as elected, Dubček is saying that he wants to bring in, more democratic and individual freedoms to the Czech people. What happens in response is that the Brezhnev Doctrine is going to be put in place. The Soviet Union rolls in its tanks and then begins to invade Czechoslovakia. And at that point, Czechoslovakia has to kind of like shrink up together, meaning that they could not withstand the Soviet military, and from that point they had to be really strict and even more conservative, even more communist. Okay, so Brezhnev Doctrine is where, kind of like the Truman Doctrine, except opposite, right? So the Brezhnev Doctrine says that wherever a satellite state of the Soviet Union is looking to change its government and get rid of communism or their leader that they support, right? The Soviet Union has absolute authority to come in and to take control, to reestablish, right, communist rule and intervene in any types of like rebellions or revolts. Okay, all right, let's jump over to Germany. Germany, because it's divided east-west, Berlin Wall and stuff. Okay, in Berlin, West German Chancellor is Willy Brandt, and he begins to look at how can he improve relationships with the Eastern Europe side, and so Ost, I believe, is east in German, and so Ostpolitik is looking at how they can build up a better relationship with the east side, and so there's a lot of negotiation that goes on. I don't think we need to talk about the exact politics about that, but the main point is that Brandt is going to actually bring the SPD, right, the German Social Democratic Party, to power, right, and this is the first time since the 1920s, so they're back in power. And this is where, because of this reduced the East-West tensions, and they're trying to just establish a peace settlement. West Germany is trying to establish a peace settlement with other Eastern European countries, and from that, West Germany's tensions with the eastern side is improved. Okay, all right, and so we talked about this in class 2. Détente is going to be signified with Brezhnev in that he is trying to reduce East-West tensions. It's a very much like a realpolitik. You're trying just to be not being going off your passions, but being realistic. Make your policies based upon your national interests. You know, what's the reasons for your leadership, right? Your government to make these types of things. One example of détente are the SALT talks. SALT talks stands for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks. So that means that they're going to put a limit upon how many nuclear missiles they're going to be making instead, because they're making, you know, like thousands at a time. Are they even using them on each other? No, they're not. So let's just understand that, you know, we can reduce tensions by agreeing to this. Also, there's an event called the Helsinki Conference, which also is an example of détente. Helsinki is the capital of Finland, and this is where they signed the final act. Okay, this is an official treaty in agreeing that World War II is now finally over. Okay, and one event that will signify the change from détente of relaxation of these high tensions during the Cold War is in 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and so the U.S. is very upset about this. Yada, yada, yada. Just another thing that kind of tips the scale again. And so this is kind of where you have the United States supporting Afghan rebels to fight against the Soviet Union, and so tensions can shift back once more. Okay, solidarity is an important thing that we talked about in class. Okay, solidarity is coming from Poland, and where this came from is that the Pope at that time went to Poland because Poland is an extremely Catholic country, and so as he was preaching and he's talking to them about, you know, like, you know, the love of God, and also talking about how man has inalienable rights, kind of like John Locke-ish stuff. A movement started to build up called Solidarity, right? And the leader of this movement is Lech Walesa, okay, Lech Walesa. I can't speak Polish. And so what is he? Okay, he basically is just a union organizer who wanted to demand for the right for free trade unions, right? So union for laborers, right? The right to strike, the freedom of speech, a lot of individual rights that he believes that it should be entitled to the people. Okay, what ends up happening is that the Polish government is still communist, and at that point, the Soviets said, you need to handle this, and eventually Solidarity is going to be crushed and stopped. Okay, all right. So that's the Brezhnev era. Remember, I talked about how we either look at the Soviet Union within each era, what are the main type of events that are happening. Then we're going to go over to Gorbachev era, and this is kind of the end. Okay, so with Gorbachev, you have basically major reforms needing to happen because he inherits the Soviet Union at this time where it's kind of falling apart, and there's a lot of tensions that are going to need to be reduced. All right, so the reforms that are important are going to be economic and political. The first one is going to be perestroika, which is the restructuring of the economy because the economy was struggling so much. Gorbachev had to institute some free market, some capitalistic types of principles in the economy, a lot like Lenin's NEP. It just now it's 60 years later, and so perestroika would not be enough, right, to go through. Then there's glasnost, which is talking about having more free speech and having some political freedoms, reducing censorship, and this actually was more successful than perestroika. Then we have, can't I pronounce this, democratia. This is where Gorbachev was beginning to bring up that the Communist Party had a lot of corruption within it, and that he wanted to bring in some experts that are educated in being part of a political party that is going to help in deciding major decisions for the government. And so this is the point where he opens up free elections for the first time since 1917. Okay, so remember, why were there free elections in 1917? Is because that's where, okay, the provisional government was overthrown, Lenin and the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, right? And so that's where free elections was. But since then, there has never been an election because it's always been one party, right? Okay, so this is kind of where Gorbachev represents, right, a lot of relaxation of not just tensions between foreign countries, but even within the Soviet Union and its influence, its sphere of influence in the Eastern Europe nations. Okay, so this comes, and we're going to see the revolutions of 1989. Okay, let me explain a little bit more lax things. So Gorbachev reducing foreign tensions, but also will withdraw troops from Afghanistan and also encourage some reforms in Poland and Hungary. As far as the Brezhnev doctrine, is he Brezhnev? No. So he's actually going to repudiate the Brezhnev doctrine, and he's going to respect the political choices of Eastern European people. So because he's respecting the political choices of Eastern Europe, right, this is going to make a huge significance on the revolutions of 1989 because they take place in Eastern Europe. Because the Soviet Union was struggling themselves, it's really hard to maintain these satellite states, both politically and economically, and so it was way too much of a burden. Poland is going to be what we talked about with solidarity, right? Now, before it was removed under Brezhnev and like crushed, and basically they wanted to hunt solidarity down. Now it's legalized again, and then they had free elections in Poland. Okay, that is going to be kind of like the domino effect, in the sense it would trigger a wave of more independence, self-determination, freedom movements throughout Eastern Europe. They're going to elect the first non-communist leader, and it's going to be, who do you think? Lech Walesa, yes. And so he's going to be president in 1990. Okay, then you have Hungary as another example of they're going to, demand for independence. Okay, and this is still what 1989. So the Soviet Union is not gone yet; it's just weak. Okay, and then we have Czechoslovakia, and there's something called the Velvet Revolution. Okay, velvet as in like red velvet cake, I guess. Okay, so this is in 1989 as well. Okay, and because of the fall of Berlin Wall, which we'll get to, right, that happens in 1989 as well, right? Many people in Czechoslovakia begin to be inspired by, like, hey, they are now, bringing unification in Germany. It's no longer separation, and so in Czechoslovakia, they want to also break away from Soviet influence. And so there's a general strike that goes on throughout the country, and eventually the communist government will fall. Okay. In 1993, a few years later, the Czechoslovakia will split into the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and now you have the Czechs and the Slovs, right? Because they're ethnically different, they can have their own unified or separate states. Okay, and then you have Bulgaria in 1989. They too have gotten rid of the communists, and they will gain independence, like Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Romania as well. They would actually have a violent coup d'etat, and finally they overthrow the communist government. Okay, so now let's talk about the Berlin Wall. Okay, the Berlin Wall was significant not just for Germany, but for the other countries that saw what happened in this split. Okay, because we talked about how the Berlin Wall, when it was set up, is an actual physical representation of how the communist government is trying to keep things in control the way that they want it, and they control the lives of the citizens, right? So the fact that the Berlin Wall would come down is because Gorbachev basically did not tell them directly, but he said, you know what, just people want to cross, let them cross, right? And so over time, people just were more open, and finally the wall is going to be broken down. Okay, now the wall's distributed into pieces all over the world in different museums. Okay, significance. All right, so because now East Germany, West Germany once was different politically, economically, and now you're going to be unified, although it wasn't that smooth because as far as German politics goes and the economy goes, it was a struggle at first because the Aussies, the East Germans, and the Westies, the West Germans, kind of had different lives, right? The Aussies felt like they're always second-class citizens now because they lived a very, to be honest, second-class citizen life compared to the First World. The Westies felt like they always had to kind of like support the East Germans in paying taxes to rebuild the East, because the East and the West, they look totally different, right? But over time, Germany's going to be coming up again economically, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture in terms of the European Union and all that kind of stuff. Okay, all right. A few other things. Yugoslavia is going to go through civil war. This can go back into your decolonization sheet. So the reason why this happens is because that there are just a lot of ethnic conflicts that goes on, ethnic differences. So they have overall they're Slavic, but then there's different types of Slavic people, right? Kind of what we talked about with nationalism, World War I, okay, the Balkan crisis. So their president wanted to have a Serbian-dominated Yugoslavia. Although now, right, you don't have Yugoslavia, you have a bunch of different countries, right? So because there are other ethnic groups, other Slavs called the Croats and the Slovs, right, from Croatia and Slovenia within Yugoslavia, they declared independence, and they're going to fight Serbia within Yugoslavia, right? So Yugoslavia is the general territory, and then you have Serbia, Croatia, Slovenia, and they're all trying to gain their independence away from Yugoslavia because they said Serbia, because the president wanted Serbia to be in charge, right? Then you have Bosnia and Herzegovina. They would also declare their independence, and then civil war just breaks out. Okay, so now you have Bosnian Serbs that don't like these Bosnian Muslims, right? And they begin to fight each other. And so there's ethnic cleansing, which we talked about in class. That's good. Okay, and then we have basically some agreements that will divide up Bosnia between the Serbs and the Muslims as kind of a way of peace. And then you finally have the Kosovo crisis that happens in 1999. The fall of the Soviet Union. Okay, so the long-term causes of why the Soviet Union is going to fall is because, well, it could not protect its Eastern European countries and maintain them because they were just struggling themselves, right? The need for reforms throughout the Soviet Union, many times the middle class was, kept demanding for more freedoms and rights, okay, especially going to the 1970s and 1980s, right? And talked about how the economy was very stagnant, the economic crisis that was going on, and they just can never really keep up. Over time, because of the oppression that has been happening, there's been a lot of resentment of Russians in different Soviet republics. So as we know, okay, USSR stands for the Union of Soviet Republics, Socialist Soviet Republics, and so especially in the Baltic region, so Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia are going to be the ones that have the most resentment. Okay, and so there's going to be an unsuccessful coup d'etat in 1991. This is where Gorbachev, right, who seems very liberal, right, not very conservative at all. The conservatives are trying to overthrow him. He would fail, and at that point, he's going to step down. So with Boris Yeltsin as taking over as the first president, he is of Russia. He is part of the Russian Republic, one of the republics of the Soviet Union. Yeltsin, and because he's very liberal, he's going to declare that Russia as a republic is going to be independent, and all the other republics of the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union is called the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics, they're going to follow him too. And by 1991, we're going to see the Soviet Union is now in its own 15 separate republics, and Russia is just its own. Okay, later it's going to be put together. It's going to be the Russian Federation. Okay, all right. So coming after him, Boris Yeltsin will struggle because it's a brand new country again, right? Every time it's a new country, they're very unstable, and so he would struggle in trying to improve the Russian economy. And so the transition, the main point is the transition for Russia from going from a communist country going to a more democratic to a capitalist country is going to be slow and gradual, and they're going to struggle. Okay. Then we have in 2000 we have Putin, right? Putin is going to take over. Vladimir Putin, he's the guy on the right. I don't think the AP test can really ask too much about him. Just know that he comes after. He used to be part of the KGB. But yes, then you have, of course, we talked about economic challenges. It's going to be a struggle. That the shift for Eastern Europe and for the Soviet Union in general, it's going to be a learning process. It's a learning curve of how to change. Okay, so Chechnya is a republic that's part of Russia. They're down in the southern part of the Caucasus region, next to Georgia, kind of by Armenia, Azerbaijan. Chechnya has a lot of Muslims, and because of that, they are going to demand for independence themselves. So this is kind of another example of nationalism. There's going to be a rebellion that breaks out between the government and some rebels, and they're going to fight for about 10 years, and eventually they're going to gain their own independence as well. Okay, all right, so I hope we looked at those types of focus questions, right, those focus points, and how it applies to all these things. One last section is going to be European Union.